Questions or comments? Just introduce maybe a little bit. We've only met recently, but I've been working with Neil Wilson in OpenText, and he will be giving a presentation here in the fall related to the health industry. The OpenText has been working with us in a number of major projects. We have a grant from Canary working on a thing called a Health Informatics Collaboratory across Canada. More recently, they've joined with us in several other projects. What we found in working with this platform, particularly my interest was as an educational platform, was to have an environment where we could literally do anything, manage documents, be able to interact with students, be able to even have a teaching platform where asynchronous education can occur. That work is underway. We're preparing some releases of information about that, and I think it'll be interesting to people to see really what's possible. So that work initially started here. Frank Tompa was the founder of OpenText and worked on the Oxford English Dictionary, and the work in organizing and searching and so on within that document led to quite a powerful platform. One of the interesting problems about the technology, and I don't know if you can comment on this, is the translation of this technology into the hands of health professionals is actually incredibly challenging. Mm-hmm. There have been forays in the past of OpenText into the health field. There are new ones underway. But this just doesn't fit in with us in the health field. And I know people like Rena and so on might be able to comment on this. Others may be able to as well. But what drove it to be accepted and adopted in the pharmaceutical industry? And what lessons can we get from the health area?
Number one is regulatory compliance. If you look at the software expenditure in the pharmaceutical industry, in excess of 40% of the expenditure is driven by regulatory compliance. I was telling people at lunchtime, Schering-Plough just got a $500 million fine for being non-compliant. The FDA has regulations, you shall do things like this. They were inspected, they were not doing things like that. They were told they were very bad. They said, we were very bad, we admit it. There's something called a consent decree where we put money down and we say we're going to fix it by this deadline. They didn't fix it by the deadline and they got nailed. It's not just Schering-Plough. That was an example. That's one of the biggest ones recently. Abbott got a $300 million fine. So I can tell you, if you go in front of a pharmaceutical company and say, knowledge management is good, it's good that we make decisions, and you've got this vice president of knowledge management who said, yeah, it probably is, but I don't have any money to buy it. What traditionally has happened is you had a chief information officer who was there saying, we've got too many systems, we've got to try and rationalize and standardize and make it better. And he's trying to do that, and the scientists are saying, no, I'm not going to use Microsoft Office to do my molecular simulations. Go away. It's very typical in a pharmaceutical company that, in fact, the research department has its own IT department because they have a big fight with CIO. And head of research has enough money to say, screw you, I'm going to have my own IT department. Now what's happening, though, is that people are realizing that whereas the FDA and HPP and so on used to go in and inspect a manufacturing plant, and they would look at how the process happens in the manufacturing plant, if the company can't respond to decrees like that, the company isn't being run well. So I'm going to go look at the top. How is the company being run? And so they're saying, if we don't put our house in order, we're going to get nailed with one of these big fines. We could be put out of business. Our stock will go down by 20, 30, 40, 50%, which is what happens in these situations, and that senior management care about. So there people are able to make a budgetary statement that we need this software, we need this approach in order to stay in business. It's very straightforward. And the pharmaceutical industry can afford things like that. What's generally we see in the healthcare industry is that most healthcare organizations do not have a document management system. This is something that the pharmaceutical industry had 10 years ago. They had to have it 10 years ago because they needed to document their processes, they needed standard operating procedures, they needed to record what they had done, and they needed to make it in submissions that we were talking about. It's not true in healthcare organizations, and they don't have the budget. Document systems traditionally could cost millions of dollars by the time they're deployed. So really, the question is there a regulatory driver that will, that healthcare organizations will say, we have no choice. Biggest driver right now for the healthcare industry in the States is HIPAA, which is the regulations about patient privacy and portability, how you exchange information. In the pharmaceutical industry, we have something called 21 CFR Part 11, which is roughly the equivalent. It says, how do you manage electronic records? All of those regulations I talked about used to assume that you had paper and ink signatures This is the authoritative document, sign it, keep it in a filing cabinet, don't let other people touch it, etc., etc. What are the electronic equivalents to that? And HIP is starting to do the same thing, but it's very far-reaching, from an outside. It seems to be huge demands that most people are ignoring because the demands are so huge. And we saw that with 21 Part 11. In the pharmaceutical industry, there were requirements for how do you manufacture, how do you run clinical trials, how do you run your labs, etc. Good practices, it's called. All these predicate rules that describe what you're supposed to do, that assumed that there were paper. The FDA came out with 21 Part 11 that said, okay, this is what you replace all of the paper with electronic, and it started to have a life of its own. The FDA commissioner a few years ago, I heard him talk, he said, from good-intentioned people, it's the worst possible thing we could have done. Because what started to happen is you comply with those regulations. And recently the FDA withdrew a lot of the guidance documents. They not only published the regulations, they published a lot of documents that say what the regulations mean and what you should interpret them. They're coming back and they're saying now, really look at it on a risk basis, go back to those predicate rules. It's not that electronic document is inherently different than a paper one. You make the assessment based upon why you had to have the record in the first place. So what I was finding a few years ago, this is a long-winded answer, I apologize, but what finding a few years ago was that some companies were panic-stricken. We have to comply to 21 Part 11, it's the law, we have no choice. Some of the big companies were saying, it's idiotic. I will do things that make sense and I will not do things that do not make sense. There was a requirement that all things be signed in a local time. How do you make sure that my laptop has the right time when I'm signing a document, this kind of thing. Now the FDA has backed off and said, do a risk assessment. It's hard to defend not doing something. If this is risky to a patient that's being treated with your drug, you'd better have an answer. You'd better be managing it properly. So I think this is what's going to happen with HIPAA from the outside, that it's very demanding in what it does, and it seems like most organizations are nowhere near compliance. So you'll get those that have to comply, that believe they have to comply, and you get those that are saying, I'm going to ignore it right now.
I think HIPAA will make a difference. I think medical errors will make a difference, the emphasis on that. But there needs to be, within the healthcare system, of course it's a different situation, something that manages the paper that isn't managed by the hospital information system or the departmental system, which is a huge morass of paper or documents, in this case maybe produced through email or other exchanges, yet that are becoming an important part of the operation of the institution. All of that's lost. I mean, even the whole event of SARS is lost in our healthcare system. There's very little documentation of all of the things that go on in shutting down the hospitals, dealing with visitors. Virtually none of that is recorded in our systems. That's recorded on a separate agenda, if you want. And there's no mechanism right now for managing that information.
Yeah, so there are those two sides. As you say, there's no documentation. There's also no process, and so each hospital responded differently because there was no standardized way to respond and no best practice equivalent. And if there was one, then you'd be using some of these collaborative tools. So I think at this point in time, you have to be looking for that really important single concept, the one like I described with case report forms for clinical research organizations. Most difficult, you ask people, what is the biggest problem you have? I can't find the paper. And that is critical. What's the equivalent thing in healthcare?
I had a question about what OpenText is going to do with Centrinity now that they've bought them. You've described what I think of as a big C collaboration, billions of dollars at stake, lots of reason to do it. Healthcare, at least in Ontario, I work at a teaching hospital, is more small C collaboration. Does OpenText see this as a marketplace for their collaboration tools? And if they do, what are some of the things they might be thinking of?
We're still, to be honest, we're still trying to figure out what we're going to do with Centrinity. Centrinity, I mean, there's what Centrinity's current business is. For those people who don't know, this is this messaging system that I talked about. They have I think we're the 4th or 5th largest email server vendor in the world now as a consequence of the Centrinity. So the Centrinity first-class software is widely deployed in organizations that couldn't afford Microsoft's steep price. Microsoft Exchange server for 1,000 users is X number of dollars. A university, we need so many Exchange servers and simply can't afford it. So there's wide deployment in I think it's 9 million users or something of Centrinity for kind of email and voicemail and so forth integration. one of the interests, not to say where we're going with it, but one of the interests that we had was in the context of things like the meeting zone that I talked about. Because and how we manage content in general, voicemail is just as important as text. And that's true in the pharmaceutical industry especially. They're coming down to say that this is a vital corporate record. If I call up somebody and give them permission to change a process in a plant, and it's on their voicemail, and they destroy it, they've destroyed an essential corporate record which was required. So we have to start treating a wide range of different media types as corporate records. And so that, that's quite independent of what Centrinity's first-class software as it, would be done as itself. But we see the need within the other kinds of things that we do to manage other kinds of content, including voice.
Other questions in the back? Anyway, it'd be interesting to see what happens and where it goes from here. In terms of the pharmaceutical product line, how do we get information on that? How do we get access to this or see how it works, or are there websites for it?
Very shortly, you'll be able to go to pharma.opentext.com as the entry into that. We have the contents on our website, but you need to know where to look. Very classic problem of a hierarchically organized website. And one of the things that we're recognizing, I talked about different people's roles. Come in and tell the system what you're interested in, and it'll present you according to your interests. And so the entry point for people from the pharmaceutical industry will be pharma.opentext.com.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much.
Okay,
Appreciate it.
Thank you.